Hello and welcome to Get Yourself Optimized. I'm your host, Stephan Spencer, and today I'm very excited to have David Kahn with us. David is a lifelong spiritual practitioner, musician, engineer, and healer. His main passion is in research and developing therapies associated with sound, music, and frequencies that have powerful effects on allowing people to shift into deeper states of consciousness, to activate their own innate self-healing capabilities. David, it's so great to have you on the show.
Good day, Stephan. It's excellent to be here.
Yeah. So let's first of all talk about what is sound healing. How does that work?
It's a bit of a misnomer, to be honest, because we always do our own healing. You know, it's activating the body's innate wisdom. But there's two ways in which sound can have a deep effect on us. One is vibroacoustically, where it actually resonates inside the body. So it actually starts moving stagnated life force energy in the body. And then what I've seen with that is that's usually where it moves emotional blockages out. It's kind of like a blanket acupuncture, you could say. And it just sort of moves like masses of stagnant emotions out. And the other is so vibroneurologically, which is basically where it shifts the state of consciousness. And it can happen through music and also through brainwave entrainment, but your brain essentially is entrained into either deeper states or faster states. You can have more accelerated or high performance states happen with music as well, as we all know from dance music and loud heavy metal.
Yep, right. And so when you say stagnant emotions, what would be something that would be an example of that? And maybe even if you could share an example from your life or from a client's life, anonymizing them, of course, to protect their
Sure,
privacy.
totally. Well, my partner and I, we worked at a sound healing complex in Bali, Indonesia. They're called the Pyramids of Chi. So it's a very unusual place because they built scale replicas of the pyramids of Giza, the Pyramid of the Sun, the Pyramid of the Moon, in the middle of the jungle in Bali. And I think it just gets a lot of traffic because they literally just have a poster in town and everybody's like, there's pyramids out there? I've got to check this out. But it's this beautiful open space area that people come specifically for sound healing. And at the time, most of what I had been doing was related to the vibroneurological side. And when I showed up there, I had this new experience of basically lying down on a bed with 70 other people in this large pyramid structure. And there would be a group of people that were playing gongs and singing and using crystal bowls and various instruments that basically are tuned in a specific way to resonate with different sympathetic resonances within the body. And the big thing that I experienced myself was, oh my God, I'm feeling distracted, I'm feeling angry, I'm feeling irritated, and all these emotions were coming up, and I literally just felt them come out, because by the end of the 45-minute session, I was completely tranquil. And I liken it much to most, it's a common process I find with any sort of activity we do for self-improvement, whether it be running or whether it be breath work. The first part is always difficult. Stuff's always coming up. The inner critic is always sort of getting. And so these are all ways of really kind of processing our emotions, you could say. But sound healing goes a bit deeper, I find, because it really shakes up that which is in the body, that which might be stuck. A lot of practitioners, I'm thinking acupuncturists or medical qigong, they might say, oh, your liver is holding a lot of anger. And that doesn't mean a lot of things to people, but maybe it's their habitual use of the anger emotion that causes anger to back up in that organ and express inappropriately. After a few sessions, I basically got talking and somehow got my way in there as a practitioner at these pyramids. So I was working there with rather advanced technology. It was kind of fun. We used a strobe light that was tuned to our musical compositions. And then we'd use a waterbed in which all the music would travel up through the waterbed. So everything was mic'd up. And so people would be lying down and the strobe light would be entraining their brain into a deep theta. And the music we'd be playing would be coming up through the bed. So it'd be massaging them as they're sort of getting this vibroacoustic effect traveling through the body. And every single time people came out of there, they had to move very slowly. And a lot of the time, people were quite new to this. Some people hadn't even heard of sound healing. Some people hadn't really heard of alternative modalities. Some people were really just tourists that literally saw a pyramid in the jungle and said, "This looks interesting. I'm going to go try it out." Or they heard about it from a friend who was more into the stuff than they were and decided to try it out. So that we would really get a huge range, because other people were very well adapted to alternative modalities. So we could get more articulate sort of descriptions of what was happening from them. But it was always described as a release. A lot of the time people were very emotional afterwards. So there's a lot of crying, a lot of tears coming up. They were remembering things they had forgotten, remembering sort of what was near and dear to their heart, what they actually cared about in life that maybe they had been neglecting. And the recommendation was pretty much unanimous, was, this is a beautiful area. You can go sit in the garden, have a cup of tea, just relax, just integrate. And usually after that integration, we would give them our email or something, and we'd hear from them later. And we'd usually hear some sort of a story a few days later. Hey, you know what? That experience, it really brought me back in touch with a part of me I had been neglecting because I've been working too much. And, I really want to do something more artistic or creative, so I'm going to take up painting. And then, lo and behold, 5 days later, they'll message us and be like, "I bought all this, painting stuff, and I'm really excited. Thank you guys for the experience." That would be an example of sort of what can happen from these.
Yeah, really cool. Really cool. So when you said it can access and bring up memories from distant past, like early childhood memories, I had an experience when I did 40 Years of Zen, which is a program in the Seattle area. It's run by Dave Asprey and his team. He's not there; it's his team that runs it. But it's really powerful. It's a week-long program where you get into alpha and theta brainwave states through neurofeedback, and then you also do these augmented reset processes, and it's super powerful. I had memories unlocked that I hadn't had since I was a little child. It was really, really cool. So I'm curious, did you have any particular memories or scenes come to you from early childhood, or maybe even from a past life from doing this kind of work?
For me personally, I don't really have a lot that happened in my childhood that was traumatic, believe it or not.
Well, the thing is this wasn't traumatic. This was just a really nice...
it was a really nice memory.
Yeah, fun memory.
So, for me, actually, a lot of stuff is other lives, it feels like. That's what drove me into mysticism. When I was growing up, I always had, I wouldn't say anything traumatic, but I always had this attachment or affinity for other lives. So whenever I go into these deeper states, it becomes almost fantasy-like. That would be the best way to describe it. It's kind of fantastic in a way, because it doesn't feel like this reality. It feels like a very different time and place. However, if I look at those stories or images as allegories, there's usually some sort of an archetypical significance to them. So I don't tend to sensationalize them or try to run off into these other experiences or even really talk about them too much, but I look for the common threads, because our subconscious minds are so brilliant in revealing to us some of the aspects of our lives that may have played out elsewhere, or they might tell it a different way. I don't know if it's true or not, but it sure is a nice story to tell. I feel it's true, but I can't verify that scientifically.
Yeah, gotcha. So how do you start down this path? If you're a listener to this podcast and you've never tried any kind of sound healing or mystical kind of work, where would you suggest starting? Is it maybe even something more traditional like acupuncture or medical qigong, or is it more like just jump in, do a sound bath, or do a some sort of mystical experience accessing past lives?
Not even that, man. I would say the most profound experience with this, one of the most profound ones I've had, is going out into the desert, taking a walk, finding a nice shaded area where you can't really hear the 50 to 60 cycle hum of electricity anymore. That is key. I'll tell you, since the Industrial Revolution and sort of electricity we've been surrounded by a 50 to 60 cycle hum. It's basically the AC power in the wall. And that is entraining our brains higher. So it keeps us in a more beta state, if not moving us towards gamma at times. However, when we're out in the desert and you get that true silence and you don't hear planes, you don't hear cars, desert or forest, anywhere that has natural sounds again. And the other thing, there's another thing, there's the stereoscopic imaging, and that's a big word, but what that means is where in your sound field do you hear something? So if you hear a bird flying from right to left, your brain has to recalibrate that. And it actually has a very soothing effect if you pay attention. Okay, there's a bird flying from right to left, or there's something moving. I can hear a fox kind of shuffling through the bushes in front of me, and it's moving closer, and then it's moving further away. And so when we pay attention just to sound in a natural environment, that has an extremely powerful therapeutic effect. Mm. And one of the things that I use in the soundscapes that I create is that we actually go to places that have a very high natural charge to them. Like you can just feel the land there. And we record sounds of nature, of ambient nature, and we'll leave the recorder on for a while. We'll be very quiet, and we'll just let nature sort of come back and sort of express itself. And then we put those into the soundscapes, as opposed to using just stock nature sounds, because my partner and I like to keep our signature on everything we do. But that would be my first. It would really be go into nature and experience the profound peace that you get from there.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
And have you been to some of the more powerful vortices in the world, like Sedona, and recorded soundscapes there?
Well, I got into the recording more when I was in Bali. And since Bali, I've lived in South Africa.
Okay.
And so South Africa has some incredibly powerful places. That's another discussion, because it's got these ancient sites that are archaeoastronomy sites that for hundreds of thousands of years have been used for rituals on the equinox and the solstice, because the sun will come in, hit a rock formation, like a Stonehenge-like effect. That's a whole different story. But we visited these places and we get some of our sounds from there. And so the sounds themselves are charged up, but I've wanted to, and especially when I feel travel opens up again, go back to some of the places in the Western US. Some of my fondest experiences in life are from Sedona and places in Utah and Colorado, up through Montana and California. I mean, that part of the world, to me, it really sings.
Yeah. So what brought you to Bali?
I was always very interested in Bali. It just seemed like a place where people could gather and talk freely about some of the things that, might not be so easy to talk about in consensus reality in our normal society. Usually we have a couple friends in our city or town that are like-minded, but in Bali, it's all the weird people get together. And so, it feels like a little bit of a big sort of organic dance party a lot of the time. Like the energy is very high, but then you meet some of the most amazing people, like they're, building these island communities, for instance, or, they're developing free energy machines or something along the line. You get this real sort of brilliant innovator, and you get enough of that together in an area, and sort of you can feel the collective consciousness of the area really rise. And for me in particular, I'm very sensitive to the psychic soup of wherever I live. So if I live in an area that's quite industrial, I tend to get more dull. And if I live in an area that's very vibrant, I open up and expand. So for me, it's actually quite important to live in some of these places where the land's powerful and people are quite powerful.
What would be an example of an early experience psychically where you realize, like, wow, I have a lot of psychic sensitivity?
Well, when I was 17, I had a near-death experience. So that was sort of the start of the whole thing. Yeah, I basically was out in a Canadian winter, and I got trapped outside, suffered hypothermia, and my body temperature dropped way too low. Somehow, then I woke up, and somehow I got myself back to safety, and then was collapsed for several weeks after that. So that experience there, at first it didn't really sink in, but in the months after that, it started to thaw out in a way. That's the way I kind of think of it. My consciousness thawed out, and I started asking much bigger questions about life. And then the universe brought me a friend, actually, at the time, who was quite an interesting character. He was a very gifted martial artist he just had that like Jedi-like awareness. So running around at 18 and having a friend to be able to connect with on that level was very helpful for me. And after that, sort of, I went off the deep end, went way too far into spirituality, and then sort of pulled back for a few years. And right now, I've found more of a healthy balance between, the physical, material world and sort of the spiritual dimensions.
So tell me more about how you went over on the deep end of spirituality. It seems like an oxymoron or some. I don't know. It just doesn't. It doesn't compute for me. It's like, oh, I've just been too kind, too thoughtful.
Well, I guess for me it would be the inability to integrate and to relate with other people.
Okay.
For me, one of the things that's very important in life is to be relatable with whoever I'm with. And so one of the going off the deep end was, I remember in early university, I wasn't really showing up for class. I didn't care. I was studying engineering at the time. And I was just like, I just want to do spiritual stuff. So I was doing Kundalini yoga 6 days a week. I was going on hiking trips for multi-days. It was nice on one hand, but it was a bit disconnected. And so my strategy after that just became to be, okay, I'm going to become more integrated. I'm going to really kind of find that. So then I went far in the other direction of science, engineering, really understanding the sort of the material sciences. And then now I've sort of struck a balance. And that's, I find, very helpful, because this work I do with sound is a blend of being very intuitive and really tuning in and bringing a quality of attention and frequency to the work, but also using the science as a structure, as a framework to pull from.
What does intuition mean for you? I'm curious.
For me, it would be an arising that I can't explain. It's sort of like moving in real time in response to the environment that I'm in.
Would you say that it might be accessing something beyond you in some way?
I think it's accessing more of me. That's the way I feel it. I think it's just the deeper layers of myself. And I think those deeper layers become more interconnected between all people, forming almost like a membrane throughout the whole universe. At the deepest level is the pure love force that connects everyone. And then from there, sort of, we become more and more separate. And I believe, too, from what I've seen with brainwave research, is that is a deep delta state. That's when we're asleep. But as we sort of go up through theta, we sort of become transpersonal. Sort of the boundaries between people are a bit more malleable. But then in alpha and beta, we view ourselves as very separate individuals.
Yeah, we're an ego.
Yeah, which isn't, I don't think ego is bad per se. I think egos can be healthy and they can be unhealthy. And I also don't think, too, that we need to be in theta all the time.
Right.
I think theta all the time is sort of, looking at the stars or lying on the beach. And, it might not serve us if we have a purpose that involves creating something.
Yeah, taking action, right? Because we do live in a physical universe, and we have to pay the bills and build stuff. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. So let's talk more about sound. Like, what is a soundscape? I'm not really that familiar with that term.
Well, that's a term that I've used because what I've created contains many layers that are musical and non-musical. So what I put into the soundscapes that I create, I'll start with an intention. What do I actually want to do? So recently we did one for the spring equinox. And the spring equinox in astrology is when it's really the astrological new year. That's when everything starts again. We end Pisces, which is the house of endings, and we begin Aries, which is the house of new initiation. And so the ancient astrologers actually, the whole astrology is based on where the sun rises on the spring equinox. And spiritually, the sun is the solar consciousness, is the soul, the Christ consciousness in many traditions. And that basically it's evolving the earth. So whenever the sun hits the earth on these solstice or these equinox days, there's a certain quality of light that the earth then integrates. And so this has been seen across the world in many ancient cultures. So what we did was we took a frequency of 136 hertz, which is found in many of the temples around India. The instruments are tuned to that frequency. It's also a higher, this is going to sound a bit mathematical, it's related to the frequency at which the earth orbits the sun. It's just we multiply it enough so it actually speeds up into a sound. Because 365 days, if you multiply that by 2 enough times, you'll get a sound.
All right.
And that's the law of octaves. You know, if you play on a piano, if you play A down here and you play the next A, they sound the same. And if you keep going up in A's, you eventually reach the end of the piano, and you'd eventually reach the end of the audible range. But the A's don't stop. They then go into a different range, an ultrasonic range. So we take an intention first, and our intention was to basically use sunlight to activate the pineal gland during this time. So helping people let go and decondition any mental impressions and basically reset themselves in a way where they're more tuned into themselves for the spring. So once we get that intention, I'll go and I'll create a brainwave, what is called an isochronic. It's similar to a binaural beat, which people have heard of. Mm-hmm. Isochronic has some qualities. In research, it's been shown to be more effective, first of all. Second of all, it doesn't require headphones. People can just listen to it on speakers. And third of all, it doesn't rely on the brain to actually image it. So with a binaural beat, what happens is the brain does all these calculations. And so not everybody's simulation of reality works the same. And so binaural beats can just not work for some people because their brains don't compute what's happening. A binaural beat is when a frequency comes in the left ear and comes in the right, and they're slightly offset. And when you smash them together, you get a resulting frequency. But that resultant frequency is called an image because the brain actually calculates that. Gotcha. And so yeah, it's a bit of a scientific process there, but it doesn't always work. And so the isochronic, I'll give you a very, very easy real-world example. It's the shaman's drum. Back in ceremony, that's what it was. Because I really was very interested in shamanism for a number of years, and I always knew how powerful drumming was. And the drumming could bring you into trance states. And I'm like, that's amazing. How does it do it? Because the beat of the drum is usually around 7 hertz or so. It's kind of, we can't go faster, unless we're sort of really, really skilled with our right hand, but we can't go much faster than that. So the shamans of old would just basically play this beat, and eventually the brain would sort of entrain into that frequency of 7 hertz, which is between alpha and theta. So that's how the isochronic works, but it's created by a computer. So I can alter it. I can basically start somebody in beta so they can walk in off the street out of their day. We start at beta, and then I gently bring them down to various alpha and theta frequencies. But depending on the intention, I'll use a specific frequency that does a different thing. So we create this frequency schedule, and that takes care of most of the the vibroneurological effect. It really can, that frequency alone, without any music, some hardcore people like to listen to it, that can shift your consciousness very deeply. So we'll use that as the base, and then we add music. And so the music we add is, again, tuned to that frequency of whatever the intention is. So in this case, we took the sun frequency. And that has been shown, especially through a fellow named Hans Cousteau, who's a Swiss mathematician. He's shown that a lot of these Indian yogis actually meditated, and that's the frequency they came to through meditation. So he studied temple bells around India and found they were all within 1 hertz of 136.1 hertz. He's like, what? That's crazy. And then he found out that it's actually related to the Earth's rotation around the sun, because they saw that as the development of the soul in Hinduism. It's beautiful. It's amazing how these astronomical events can relate with spiritual concepts, spiritual development in a lot of ways.
It seems like it's kind of like an auditory equivalent to sacred geometry.
Yes, exactly. And through cymatics, which we can talk about later, we can show the sacred geometry patterns that sound creates. It's absolutely fascinating because it's made me realize that this whole universe is sound. And that when you become more musically minded, it's sort of like you understand the whole vibration, frequency, and energy thing pretty well. You just have a natural sense of it from playing music. And so that
that
go
reminds
ahead,
me,
yeah.
there's like a study I heard about. I don't remember the details of it, but is essentially that when you listen to the sound of the beginning of the universe, you get into a certain brain state and all these healing things happen. But when you listen to just, I don't know, some other sound, like some other auditory sound that is created by a human, didn't have any impact. So when they were measuring, this was a scientific study, they found only the did something valuable, and then the other sounds that they made up did nothing. Do you know what I'm talking about?
That's quite fascinating. I'd like to actually see that study to see sort of what the parameters were around that. Because one of the things I work with people with is making various vowel sounds to release tension in the body. And so, that actually sits around the heart space. So it actually begins to break away tension in the heart. As you get lower, as you go, ooh, ooh, those are more guttural sounds. So they kind of hit lower. So Om for me is this sort of sound that opens up. It's like it unzips the whole torso up through the throat and the mouth. So I could see it having a very powerful effect because it actually involves the entire front line of the body. Yeah. But I hadn't actually seen that study.
Yeah, I've got to figure out who told me about it. I think maybe it was Dr. Michael Bruce, but I'm not sure. Yeah, fascinating, fascinating. Okay, so can you maybe tell us a little bit about what the pineal gland does? Because you mentioned that sunlight can activate that, and I'm curious, what's the activity or the main function of the pineal gland?
Sure, I'll get to that in 1 sec. I did want to finish the last two components of the soundscapes.
Okay.
So the next one is nature sounds. That is very important, especially if they're recently captured, because it captures the sounds around that time of the year and the particular energy that different birds or different, even the wind patterns, the weather patterns are making at that time, which is very, very soothing. We had a big rainfall event, and so we had a gushing river. So we captured the gushing river as part of the soundscape experience. Finally, my partner she's a little bit more mystically minded than me, so she'll open up space and she uses her voice to channel. And so her voice becomes a very powerful channeler. And so a lot of people afterwards will gravitate towards saying, oh my God, your voice did this, or your voice opened this for me. So these 4 layers are all working. People tend to notice the voice, even though the other stuff's supporting it. Okay, so that's the formula for soundscape. It's 4 parts. Mm-hmm. Now, the pineal gland is basically, it's located right in the middle of our head. And it's in the middle of, I'm trying to just think of the best way to put it. If you go between the eyebrows and you go back, between the back of your head and the front of your head, you'll hit your pineal gland. Now, in ancient Egypt, they said that it was about the size of a walnut when people were basically exercising their higher bodies, exercising their psychic senses, staying in alignment with sort of the multidimensional nature. Nowadays, they claim that the pineal gland is about the size of a pea and it's a bit shriveled up. And so different people say different things. I've never cut open a head and seen a pineal gland, but various people say that that the pineal gland is calcified, or others due to environmental toxins, and other people say that it's just underused. But what I've noticed in myself is that when we begin to really value our inner world, and you could call that your spiritual practice, you could call that whatever, but when we start to trust that inner authority, our pineal gland becomes very necessary, because sometimes the way that we feel drawn to move in life involves things that aren't outside of us. They aren't logical. They aren't part of society, like why I went from Bali to South Africa, and then got involved with this line of work and that line of work that ended up becoming something I could have never seen in hindsight. I could have never seen that beforehand. And I think a lot of people have these experiences where they're like, I was just drawn to this place. I got a sign. So it's being able to read the signs that life is presenting to us to move us in the direction of our optimal evolution. But in order to see them, we have to have that open. We have to be able to think symbolically. We have to be able to think archetypically. So I'd say there's a whole list of things that people can do to open their pineal gland, and they should probably choose the ones that appeal to them most.
You know, I just was Googling while you were talking to see if I could find more about the pineal gland, and I found a book called The Pineal Gland, The Eye of God by Manly Hall. Are you familiar with
Manly
that book?
P. Hall.
Yeah, Manly P.
Well,
Hall.
I know Manly P. Hall's work quite well, but I have not heard that book. I mean, he wrote, I'm drawing a bit of a blank right now, but he wrote a book in 1927 that was like, the Secret Teaching of All Ages. That was it. Where he basically combined all the ancient mysteries into one sort of encyclopedic text. But if it's his work, I mean, I can verify he's very thorough, and he does a very good job. He was a young man when he was sponsored essentially by a very rich woman when he was 19 years old to speak about spiritual things and travel to Egypt. So he's one of those characters that lives with a high voltage in life.
Interesting. Well, this book got rave reviews, 4.5 stars, 1,500 ratings. So
very cool.
Yeah, maybe check it out.
Very cool. Yeah.
Anyways, okay, so let's talk a bit more about cymatics, because you said you could come back to that. I'm curious, what is it, and how does it work, and how does it relate to our listener?
Excellent. So cymatics is basically where sound becomes tangible and it becomes material, because essentially, here's the easiest explanation. You take a metal plate. On that plate, you scatter some sand. Okay? Not too hard to visualize.
Yep.
Then you take a speaker, put it under the plate, and then you play a frequency through that speaker into the plate and watch what happens to the sound. Because naturally, if you have something reverberating the plate, the sound's going to move. Now, the interesting thing with cymatics, and anybody can go onto YouTube and pull up a video of cymatics.
I've seen some of these videos. Yeah, they're really cool.
Mm-hmm. At various frequencies, sound frequencies, we form harmonious sacred geometry patterns. And they can form some of the most beautiful patterns. And then at the frequencies between these, we get these discordant sort of intermediate things. And so what cymatics shows us is that at certain patterns, there is great harmony in sacred geometry. Now, when those frequencies are played into our body, we can assume that the water in our body is probably going to have some correlation with the structure of the sand or the sacred geometry of the sand.
Is it the sacred geometry of the sand, or is it there's some sort of field?
It has nothing to do with the sound. The sand, sorry. It has everything to do with the field created by the frequency. The sand is just essentially a medium. You could use iron filings too. You could use anything sufficiently small, and that would be scattered by sound.
Got it. Yep. Very cool. Have you played around with this much, creating different interesting sacred geometry patterns with these plates?
I'd love to say that I have, but I've mostly watched other people's work. I've watched the work of Rupert Sheldrake did some stuff with this, actually. He did some very interesting stuff with water. He did some form of cymatics with water. I watched his work, and Emoto Masor, what's his name? The Japanese guy who worked with water.
Dr. Emoto.
I can't. Dr. Emoto, that's right. I'm just completely drawing a blank there. But yes, his work. And then there's a few other guys that I've just seen sort of just working through, but essentially on YouTube. But essentially there is consistency in what frequencies actually create these harmonious notes. The other set of frequencies too that are well known are the solfeggio frequencies, which have been used since ancient times in the Gregorian chants, essentially. So those also form harmonious notes with different sacred geometry patterns. Now, some of these sacred geometry patterns, I would just call them harmonious geometry. They might not be, it doesn't form like a perfect flower of life or anything like that for people, but there is harmony in them. There is a harmonious interconnectedness between the way that these sandgrams form.
Mm-hmm. I love Gregorian chants. I listened to those many, many years ago, before I was really anywhere near to being spiritual. Something attracted me to listening to Gregorian chants, and then I listened to Enigma because they used Gregorian chants quite a lot in their music. Yeah, something really magical about it.
Yeah, definitely. I felt the same way when I was younger. Even when I was a teenager, I liked these Gregorian chants. Mm-hmm. They did something. I was sort of a bit of a tough kid, but they would soften me up. They'd make me cry sometimes listening to them. They're so powerful. They move me so much. And I think we all get that effect, whether we're spiritual or not. That's the beauty of sound, is that sometimes we'll get people who would never identify as being spiritual or even care about anything. They just say, oh, I love music, I love sound. And then they try a sound bath and they just get it. Sometimes spirituality can be very about beliefs and what do you believe and what do you think about life after death, and do you believe about God? Do you believe about all this stuff? And none of that really matters at the end of the day. It's really what we experience, what's happening inside of us, and how we live. And sound is a powerful vehicle for attuning us to a life that's more symbiotic with nature and our nature, our deeper nature.
Yeah, I remember hearing in India from the oneness monks that the divine is an experience, not a belief.
Yes. Yeah.
Awesome. And could you describe what it's like to be in a sound bath for somebody who's never experienced it?
Well, there's different types of sound baths.
So just imagine like you go onto meetup.com or something, and then you Google sound, or you do a search there for sound baths, and there's one locally, a few miles away. What would that experience be like?
Okay, so I'll give you a couple different types. So there's the guy with the didgeridoo on meetup.com.
Yeah.
This is a common sound bath. Everyone lies on the floor, and the guy basically gets out the didgeridoo and he goes over everyone's body, and it feels really cool because it's this powerful sound that overtakes you, and you feel it like he'll be blowing, let's say, on your chest, but you'll feel it in your back because that's the vibroacoustic effect, just blowing right through your body. And so everything gets shooken up. If you have any tension in your back or anything, it starts to dissolve pretty quickly. It's a very cool feeling. It can also trigger you. You're like, what the hell is this guy doing with the didgeridoo over my body? But that's good. That's part of the experience. So type 1. Type 2 is usually more of sort of the more ethereal spiritual types, and they're very more tranquil with the crystal bowls and the crystal tuning forks, the metal tuning forks. And that's more subtle. That's more like correcting subtle things in your field. And those are really cool experiences too, but unless you have more sensitivity, you might not notice as much, except for the fact that, oh, I feel a little bit better afterwards. I feel a little bit clearer. I feel a little bit more emotionally calm. But if you have more, psychic sensing, or, you're just more sensitive, you might notice specifically what's going on in your field and what's happening during the actual experience.
So why crystal bowls and not, let's say, metal bowls?
Oh, that's a good question. So there's something called overtones. And overtones are what gives an instrument its sound. It's called timbre in music. So a trumpet playing the same note and a piano playing the same note and a crystal bowl hitting the same note, they all sound different. They're in tune because the fundamental pitch where they all start is the same, but it's the sequence of that doubling effect, which are called harmonics. So in the higher octaves, it's like, where do these get weight? So some instruments, they sound lower in pitch because they don't have these higher overtones. And other instruments sound higher in pitch because even though they have the same fundamental frequency as the first instrument, they have more of these overtones. So they go off. It's like the sound, it's a composite of these lower frequencies and higher ones. And crystal bowls, this is very interesting because crystal bowls have these higher harmonics that extend way beyond the audible range of sound. And this gets into the work that Royal Rife was doing. Are you familiar with him?
No.
Who invented the Rife Machine. So he basically, in the 30s, and this is documented, but it was kind of one of those things that was shut down, and much in the same way Tesla was shut down by some of the powers that be. But essentially, he found that between 100,000 hertz and 300,000 hertz, that he could zap cancer and obliterate it. And he was curing people in his centers, and that work did continue after he passed. But he was actually very badly mistreated by the American Medical Association. They did, at first they were funding him, and then they sort of rescinded their funding, and it turned very bad. But essentially, he was able to. He claimed, and a number of people said that he basically zapped cancer. Now, Rife machines are still in circulation today. They're very expensive, but you can find them in places like Hawaii. I know there's a doctor out there, and other parts of the US, and they're rare in other countries, but they are around. And basically what it is it's using frequencies to blast things that don't belong in the body. Now, some of these overtones with crystal bowls actually start to get into the range of those things. It's about the 11th harmonic, it's called in sound healing, is where it starts to basically blend into this range where it starts to have actual physiological effects and actually can be used. I'm not saying it's a cure, but it basically can start to vibroacoustically break down some malignant cells in the body.
Interesting. I'll have to check that out.
Yes.
Rife machines. Very cool. So you used a term earlier that I want to circle back to, and it's called entraining or entrainment.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk a bit more about what entrainment means to you?
Sure. So I'll go back to my desert walk analogy. You could also consider this a walk in a national park. That is a form of entrainment, especially if the walk is steady. If you're on a steady walk, the first hour, you're kind of warming up to the walk. You might be a little bit more out of breath. And then after a certain point, it becomes a little more effortless. And you're just sort of in it. And the thoughts sort of quiet down. You find this sort of symbiosis with the landscape that you're in. And so your brain has calmed down. You become more entrained with the environment. Now, if you were to camp for 5 or 6 days, you'd be even more in tune. You'd be waking up with the sun. You'd be going to bed when it gets dark out. You'd be moving with the natural rhythms even more. And if you lived outside, or if you lived in a cabin in the woods for a few months, you'd probably be walking through the forest and the animals wouldn't stop. You'd just sort of be another creature there. You know how to walk properly. So in that way, you're entrained into the natural environment. You become part of the flow of frequencies that are happening in that situation. And so entrainment, when we talk about it in sound healing, isn't much different. It's essentially when we're playing a frequency with either a shamanic drum or with this tone that I generate with my computer, your brain begins to synchronize it. It's called the frequency following response. So whatever frequency is being emitted, your brain begins to say, oh, I'm going to shift my dominant frequency. Now, this is very well studied in, like you were talking about earlier, neurofeedback. Neurofeedback is just that. When we learn to basically shift our consciousness, it's measurable. And so different states of consciousness exist at different frequencies. I like to say the brain is simply a frequency vault of experience. And that if the dominant frequency is operating, at 12 hertz versus 10.5 hertz, they're going to be different experiences of reality. Now, often people want to know, how deep can I go? Well, essentially, it says how deep as you'll let yourself go. So not everybody entrains the same, because there is this thing I call the the chronic, or I call it like a crust. And what that means is if people are not used to relaxing, their brains are going to entrain into this frequency, going to start following it. As the frequency descends, their brains will start going down. So they'll go from a resting frequency of maybe 14 hertz. They'll go down to about 10, and then they'll get distracted and they'll bounce back. They might get irritated or fidgety or something, and they bounce off of that, and they just kind of lose track of the sound. That is common in the beginning with some people. What I'd say is keep trying again, because when your brain becomes malleable enough to relax, then it basically follows the frequency, and it can go down into alpha, it can go down to theta, and it can go down into delta. And when it gets there, there's a lot of magic that can happen. A lot of very quick healing can happen when the body exists at those deeper layers of the subconscious. When the brain exists at those deeper layers of the subconscious, because the neuropeptides that run through our entire nervous system basically relax, we're sending new messages, so we can reprogram at this very deep level of being. And so it's all state-based. A lot of the time when people try to heal, if they're healing when they're in a beta state, when they're in normal consciousness, it's a very weak signal. But when they get down and they actually are experiencing the deeper layers of their subconscious mind, they're in a very tender place where they can rewrite themselves.
Yeah, so it's like receptivity that
exactly
you don't normally have if you're just in your head thinking about, I gotta pick up the milk or whatever on the way home, etc. You're not in a receptive place then.
No, not at all. Exactly.
Yeah. I'm curious, how do you see entrainment relating to Kundalini yoga and just the Kundalini itself?
Yes, in studying Kundalini, so having been practiced it, I can only talk about my own practice, which is about 17 years now at this point. I practiced it very intensely until I had a Kundalini-related injury. Kundalini got stuck in the middle of my back. And so I'm like, I'm going to try something else for a while at the time. So I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. I'm just saying the way that I was doing it may have been a bit unsustainable. That was part of the time in my life when I was a bit too gung-ho about things. But the Kundalini is a physiological, energetic experience. And it'd be very interesting to actually map what's going on with somebody's brain activity. Because I think that what happens is there's a common brainwave activity or map that goes along with people who have these breakthrough experiences, whether it be Kundalini, whether it be a eureka moment, where they're usually in a flow state. They're usually in alpha, they're in theta. Probably in alpha if they're just doing something and it's working. They kind of have this meditative experience. And then they shoot up into gamma. Now, gamma is a faster brainwave pattern than beta. So you'd think, oh, if beta is sort of our normal waking consciousness, what the heck's gamma? Well, gamma is very rapid. It's when people say they've downloaded information very quickly, or the brain actually activity is very holistic. It's very well distributed across the entire area of the brain. Both hemispheres of the brain become very activated. So it's a very holistic thinking, but it's just happening very fast. So I would say when people get these mystical visions and euphoria, that's what is likely happening neurologically. But again, the neurological effect of a Kundalini awakening, it isn't happening because the brain's doing this. The brain is doing this because of the experience. Sort of the brain is responding to this immense rush of energy throughout the body.
So it's like the brain is coming along for the ride. It's not creating.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of like if you load a certain program on your computer, you're going to get a certain CPU usage. The RAM's going to be allocated in the background. The RAM's not allocated and then the program opens. The program opens and then allocates the RAM. Gotcha. Or it's sort of like, you're biking to a place, and the tires are moving as a result of you biking to the place. So it's like it's the mechanism for the experience to happen.
Mm-hmm. What was the most powerful experience that you got out of doing 17 years of Kundalini yoga?
Oh, sorry. I only did Kundalini yoga for a couple of years.
Oh, you did?
17 years ago. Yeah.
Oh, 17 years ago. Okay, got it.
Yeah. For me, it wasn't anything too out of the, out of this world type of stuff. For me, it was just accessing these blissful states more regularly and feeling more integrated, feeling just being able to sit comfortably and have these beautiful sensations up my spine and being kind of perfectly happy just sitting with boredom. Because before that, I was very fidgety. I moved around a lot of tension in the body. So I found with Kundalini, it actually relaxed my nervous system and allowed me to just experience bliss, which for me was perfectly okay. Now, if you ask me what my most powerful sound healing experience, that's different.
Okay. Tell us about that.
Okay. So I had a friend, and this is the guy I learned a lot from, who studied psychology for 25 years. And he's a computer guy and a psychologist. So he's this very interesting guy to study brainwave stuff. So somehow he got his hand on some research done by a fellow named Maxwell Kane, who studied Zen monks that were 5 months in retreat. So he was studying their brainwave patterns after being in retreat for 5 months, how they fluctuated throughout their day. And so my friend got this brainwave pattern, and then he created a schedule out of it. So basically taking somebody from a normal state into the brainwave pattern of these Zen monks. And he's like, you got to try this. And I'm like, absolutely, I'll try this. So I go and I'm lying down in my bed. It's about 50 minutes long, 50. So I lie down, I put the headphones on. First 8 minutes are pretty typical. It's like you feel relaxed and you're going along. And then at some point, there's a very distinct shift. And you can really feel yourself being pulled into these deeper states. So you become very aware. It's like, okay, the thing's kicked in. And then as I continued to go with this, I went in. I had no idea of time at this point. But I remember not being able to feel the boundary of where my skin ended and the room began. And at that point, I literally felt my consciousness basically extending out. So it was non-localized in my body anymore. It was basically fluid. And it was just this amazing sense of peace and bliss and tranquility. And then, of course, at some point, the track ended. And I just lay there. And it took me about an hour. I just got up slowly afterwards. And it was just like, that was one of the most incredible experiences I've had in life of altered. I shouldn't call them altered states. I should call them deeper states of consciousness.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow. And were you able to repeat that, or was that a one-off?
I don't tend to get repeatability. I tend to get different experiences each time. So that's the thing, is that, when we hit these, we change. Every time we do one of these, we change because we're meta-programming ourselves. So if we do the same thing again, it's going to have a different effect. So every time I've done that same monk again, I haven't got the same experience. I've had different experiences, but not that one.
How does one get access to that that program, that frequency, or sound?
That particular schedule was given to me by a friend who's he holds that one very dearly.
Okay. So we won't be able to get access.
That one isn't in public circulation. I have created ones that are very similar, and that they can create extremely powerful shifts. Mostly what I work with is the earth frequency, the Schumann resonance. It's my personal belief that is how we have done everything in the ancient world. It's because we tune into this frequency 7.83 that was found. And even when the astronauts go into space, they have to put a little box that emits the Schumann resonance. It's because it's called the heartbeat of the earth. They were getting very ill when they went in, and then they went to Dr. Schumann and they said, do you know why this might be happening? He's like, you idiots. They've left the natural heartbeat of the earth. They don't have the Schumann resonate. We got to get them a Schumann resonator that broadcasts this frequency. It's because we are very connected to this planet. And so for me, in the work that I do, I try to really move people through that frequency so they connect into the earth. And then from there, we can go to whatever place we want to. We can go deeper. We can go into astral travel or Tibetan states of consciousness, as they're called, sort of these weird ones you read in the books where, people are journeying through different lands. And people have had these experiences. People have written to me afterwards and like, I literally was, flying through time and space. I was in this different realm. I was meeting all these guides, and I'm like, that's amazing. They do actually work. You have to be able to do the work.
Yeah.
That's the caveat.
Yeah. Well, even the military admits that this is not publicly necessarily, but they admit that this is a real thing that they can utilize, and they have people trained in remote viewing so that they
I've known several remote viewers. Actually, one of my mentors was a remote viewer. I can't talk too much about it because he can't talk about it.
Right.
But in the 60s, he was part of a division that was engaged in the Cold War at a different level, and they were doing it because the Russians did it first. I also know another fellow who works at the Monroe Institute, and they use these technologies more than people would actually have known. They use them in police services for various tasks. They can't tell people this. People won't believe it. They have to see it in a movie. But yes, this is well documented. It gets used. The Monroe Institute had done a whole bunch of research. They were one of the first people that worked with this technology. There was a very famous remote viewer named Joe McMoneagle, and read some of his material. It's fascinating what he talks about when they've had him go back to look at the planet Mars a million years ago and that type of thing. But anyway, they actually downloaded his brainwaves and they uploaded it into a binaural beat. And so people could listen to that and allegedly, have the same ability to remote view. So they're basically using brainwave entrainment from a famous remote viewer for helping people to build the remote viewing skills.
What's the name of that binaural beat?
That you have to get from the Monroe Institute.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Gotcha.
And that one, they guard their stuff quite heavily, meaning that there's usually, you have to take a course and then you have to buy the CD at the end of the course. And I think they're still on CD at this point in time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there a movie that was about remote viewers, like men who stare at goats or something like that?
Yes. That was a movie that came out a few years ago about remote viewing.
Yeah. Wild. Okay. So there was something that you had just alluded to very briefly earlier in our conversation. You talked about the Christ consciousness. Could you elaborate more on that?
Okay. Well, this Christ consciousness is a term I think that gets used in a lot of New Age spirituality. But what I feel really is at the heart of it, and what is at the heart of, because when I look at spirituality, I look at what many traditions did across the world, indigenous and more advanced. And the sun has always played an integral role. And personally, one of the most powerful traditions I've found is encapsulated in Christian Gnosticism, which actually dates back to, it's much entwined with Freemasonry, with the Kabbalah, the Tarot. And that whole tradition dates back to the flood. And it actually hints at an advanced technology. So all these are forms of the remnants of a more advanced civilization that existed before. But of course, we haven't proven this yet. But essentially what they say is that the sun is what we are becoming, in a way. Our consciousness is becoming that of the sun. It's a higher order of reality. And the sun is becoming the center of the galaxy. The galaxy is becoming the center of the universe in consciousness. So our lower efforts, basically, when we are unconscious or when we're angry or when we're, expressing in a way that's negative, that is food for the moon. The moon is in a lower sphere of reality than the earth, and the sun is in the higher reality. So alchemy in the Egyptian tradition, and even in India, I believe as well, is based on turning the things we produce, our excrement in a way, our energetic excrement, to the sun. So using it as fuel for the sun. And that process actually helps the earth create energetic fuel for the sun, as opposed to detritus that the moon eats, in a way. So that's sort of the esoteric side of it. And so the sun actually, ubiquitously across many traditions, in Buddhism, they call it the celestial Buddhas. They live in the sun. So it's not a physical beings in the sun, but it's the solar consciousness is one of brightness, of love, of unity, of our higher will, our higher intellect, our higher mind, and our healthy ego. And even in astrology, the sun is always what we aspire to become. So the sun is what we're moving towards should we embrace life in a conscious, loving, and expansive manner.
Interesting, because I fairly recently heard that phrase, the Christ consciousness, and I've been for the last couple of months doing this prayer daily, which is the Metatron prayer of protection, and you create these 3 rings or spheres of protection around you. You visualize this, and the first one is a silver sphere of the Christ consciousness. Yeah. It's a very powerful prayer. It's very protective. I do it.
I bet.
Morning and night. Yeah.
I mean, even tapping into the frequency of that is, I believe, the highest level of consciousness that humans can have or aspire to, or that we can name, put it like that. But because individuals have reached that, it's sort of like the 100 monkey effect. Because individuals have reached that, other people can now tap into that field.
What is the 100 monkey effect?
Essentially, or the 4-minute mile. Here's an even easier explanation.
Gotcha. Okay.
One person crosses the 4-minute mile. It was really hard. No one could do it before that. One person crosses it. Cool. Then all of a sudden, 5 people cross it because that one person did. Once 5 people cross it, 100 people cross it. So Rupert Sheldrake's work is very interesting. He calls this Morphic Resonance. And so basically, it's a field, the field of the 4-minute mile. And at one point in its evolution, it was unbreakable. Once one person does it, the field changes and it becomes possible but rare. And then the more people do it, the more the field becomes easier to access, easier to attune to. And that's sort of how religions work in many ways. The more people believe something, the more power it has to be spread.
Yep. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
so the more people tapping into the Christ consciousness, the more juice it has to attract more people.
Yeah. Very cool. Well, I think everybody should do this Metatron prayer of protection. It's very, very powerful and very, very helpful. I'll include a link to it in the show notes. I got it from Michelle White Dove, who is a
very
medium.
Cool.
She channeled this from Metatron, from the Archangel Metatron. Okay, so we're getting up to time here. I wanted to get one last question in, and then for you to share how our listener can work with you and maybe get your soundscapes and so forth. But one last quick question. Why is your organization name or company name called the Blade and Chalice?
No, it's a great question. So the Blade and Chalice is the perfect harmony of the masculine and the feminine. And in brainwave entrainment or anything spiritual, essentially it's the right brain and the left brain. When we bring our right brain and our left brain into balance, we get hemispheric resonance. So this mystical notion of the right brain being feminine, the left brain being masculine, the right brain being holistic, the left brain being analytical. When we bring them into balance, neurologically, it activates the corpus callosum in the middle, and we get access to higher wisdom. We move beyond the logical, rational mind into the higher mind. And that forms the first gate of moving into higher life, you could say, beyond the ordinary mechanical nature of reality. So for me, that symbol, looking at it, putting it as an emblem for everything, is a reminder for myself. And it's also a way to show people. And actually, the way that I do it is with Metatron's cube. I really have a resonance with Metatron as well, much like you like his prayer. So I use that sacred geometric pattern to sort of encapsulate it. And that's the Blade and Chalice too. Another reason is it's an old term. It goes back to the Knights Templar. It goes back to King Solomon. And I've always felt an affinity with the Western mysteries, sort of the Middle Ages. And so it encapsulates sort of on a cultural level, or that sort of level of those past life archetypes that I've always tapped into. It really captures that. So it has something about my personality and my essence in there, as well as having something that encapsulates the work that I do.
Very cool. Yeah. Well, I'm also a big fan of Metatron's cube. In fact, I just got my wife a pendant, beautiful jewelry of the Metatron cube. Yeah, it's from what is it? Kaz Gold Jewelry. I'll include a link, and it's very powerful, amazing sacred geometry jewelry
Brilliant.
made here in Israel. Yeah, really, really cool.
Oh.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And you kind of remind me a bit of Doctor Strange, if you're familiar with that comic book character and the whole mythology of that, and maybe the movie with Benedict Cumberbatch. Are you familiar with that movie?
I want to say it all sounds very familiar, but did Marvel do a recent one of Doctor Strange? Yes. Okay, then I am. Yeah.
Yeah, and he tapped into the metaphysical and became this incredible, powerful sorcerer. But it was all for the power of good, not for his ego to just do amazing things. But yeah, you remind me a little bit of him.
Thank you. It's big shoes to fill.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And so for folks who wanted to listen to some of your soundscapes, work with you, all that sort of stuff, where should we send them?
Totally. So yeah, I do a number of things. I do work one-on-one with people. I do sell these programs so you can work on them at home. And I also do live events. Now, the beautiful thing about the live events is they're 100% by donation. So they're a way that anybody can come out regardless of means. And so those are done on YouTube Live. You just have to register on a page. So you read the disclaimer, the safety stuff. Obviously, I want everyone to stay safe with that. So go to my website, www.thebladeandchalice.com, and you can get an overview there. If you hit /events, you'll see the YouTube live link to the next upcoming event. Also, it's probably better that I just send you the link to actually get the program if people are interested. They can try a free one first. They don't have to pay anything. They don't have to give their credit card. They can just sign up and try the free one. The first one is called Relaxation. And if they like that, they can purchase the rest of the program. And that's an at-home program that they use sequentially to go deeper and deeper and experience some of the stuff that we're talking about today.
Amazing. I look forward to that. Perfect. Well,
Great.
Thank you so much. This was fabulous, David. I really enjoyed it, and I got so much out of it, and I'm sure our listeners did too. So thank you so much.
I felt the passion. Thank you so much, Stephan. That was really, you were very engaged with this, and you brought some excellent questions. I truly appreciate it.
Thank you. And thank you, listener, for sticking through to the end and for your enthusiasm and interest. And I hope you take this to the next level and apply some of this in your life. We'll catch you on the next episode.